The reality of a medieval castle in winter was infinitely far removed from this idyllic picture. These grandiose structures, designed to serve as bastions of defense and symbols of power, were paradoxically completely unsuited to a comfortable existence in the cold season. Their huge, poorly insulated stone walls, high windswept ceilings, and countless crevices through which frost penetrated turned them into veritable heat traps and bastions of cold. In fact, the medieval castle functioned like a giant stone refrigerator in winter. Surviving in such an environment was a feat that required unprecedented stamina, ingenuity, and amazing stamina. Every day was a struggle for warmth and survival. Are you ready to learn about 20 shocking facts that are usually kept silent? About how ice and snow penetrated directly into the bedrooms of nobles, how food froze on the tables, turning into ice, and what terrible diseases lay in wait for every inhabitant of the castle, regardless of his status and position. It will be an exciting and sobering journey into a world where warmth was the most valuable currency and comfort was a near impossible dream. This is a world where every day required a struggle and existence itself was a test. Then let's start our dive into the cold reality of medieval winter. In winter, the supply of fresh food in medieval castles was depleted catastrophically quickly. The main ration consisted of prepared supplies, salted meat that was often tough, incredibly salty, and required a long soak to become edible, dried fish, dried vegetables, and cereals that were stored in large bags and barrels. Imagine endless weeks and months when the only food was this meager, monotonous set, devoid of freshness and nutrients. Vitamin deficiencies, especially the all-important vitamin C, were not just a problem, but a disaster. Scurvy, which was manifested by bleeding gums, tooth loss, severe weakness, exhaustion, apathy, and internal bleeding, was not just a rare disease, but an endemic disease that affected almost every inhabitant of the castle, regardless of their status. It undermined their strength, making people vulnerable to any other diseases and shortening their life expectancy. The meager and monotonous diet critically weakened the immune system, making the inhabitants of the castle even more susceptible to any infection from the common cold to the deadly plague. Chronic starvation or persistent malnutrition was common, especially during long sieges when supplies were severely rationed, or after lean years when grain was worth its weight in gold and food prices skyrocketed. Food, even for a lord, was more a means of survival than enjoyment. Its taste was secondary to its caloric content, and variety was considered an unacceptable luxury. In an environment where every extra high-calorie meal could be decisive, the quality of food faded into the background, giving way to availability and ability to saturate. Vegetables such as cabbage, turnips, and carrots were available only in dried or sauerkraut form, which, although it retained some of the vitamins, was significantly inferior to fresh products. Fruit was a rarity, almost a luxury, and their supply was rapidly dwindling. The need for salt was huge, as it was the main preservative. But its excess in salted meat and fish brought its own problems, such as dehydration and stress on the kidneys. In winter, life in the castle was a real test of endurance. The cold was bone-chilling, and the scanty food only served to increase the feeling of discomfort and vulnerability. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruits meant that the body did not receive the necessary vitamins and minerals. This led to a wide range of health problems, in addition to scurvy. Anemia caused by a lack of iron was common, manifesting itself in pale skin, constant fatigue, and reduced performance. People became sluggish, apathetic, and their thought processes slowed down. The children suffered from rickets due to a lack of vitamin D, which led to deformed bones and stunted growth. Even a simple cough could turn into chronic bronchitis or pneumonia due to a weakened immune system. Imagine a picture: dimly lit halls filled with people with pale, emaciated faces, constantly suffering from ailments. Coughing, sneezing, moaning from joint pain. All this was commonplace. Digestion also suffered from a monotonous and heavy diet. Constipation and diarrhea were frequent companions of medieval feasts, adding to the general exhaustion of the body. In conditions of overcrowding and lack of hygiene, any food infection could quickly spread, turning into an epidemic. During periods of prolonged sieges, the situation became critical. The castle gates were locked, and hopes of resupply were dwindling by the day. Soldiers and civilians trapped inside were forced to live on increasingly reduced rations. This led to conflicts, a drop in morale, and even cannibalism in the most desperate cases. The prices of any food within the castle skyrocketed, and only the wealthiest could afford any semblance of a balanced diet. For most people, hunger was a constant companion, reminding them of themselves with aching stomach pains and a feeling of weakness. The stone walls of the castle, built without any modern waterproofing or drainage systems, constantly absorbed moisture from the outside, whether it was torrential autumn rains or melting winter snow that seeped through the smallest cracks. This moisture did not just remain on the surface, but penetrated deep into the thickness of the masonry, making the walls dank and icy to the touch, like giant condensers of cold. At sub-zero temperatures, water accumulated in the pores of the stone froze, expanded, and gradually destroyed the stone from the inside, creating micro cracks that eventually turned into large cracks, weakening the entire structure of the castle and making it even colder. This process, known as frost destruction, steadily damaged the structure. Indoors, moisture from the air condensed on cold surfaces, forming icy growths on walls and ceilings, and sometimes on the inside of window openings. This constant dampness and lack of adequate air circulation created ideal conditions for the rampant growth of mold and mildew, which not only damaged property, rotted tapestries and clothing, but also caused serious respiratory diseases in people. From chronic coughs and bronchitis to deadly pneumonia and tuberculosis, there was no escape from the crying walls. They literally bleed with moisture and cold, making the air heavy, musty, and harmful to breathing, creating a constant feeling of discomfort and threat to health. In addition to the devastating impact on the structure of the castle itself, the constant dampness and low temperatures inside the premises had a serious impact on the health and life of its inhabitants. Clothing, bed linen, and other fabric products never completely dried out, acquiring a characteristic musty smell. Wooden furniture, chests, and crates quickly rotted and fell into disrepair. Even weapons and armor were covered with rust, requiring constant cleaning and maintenance. The leather goods were cracked and moldy. Art objects, parchments, and books, if any, suffered from humidity, their ink blurred and their pages deformed. There were no effective ways to deal with this. Hearths intended for heating were often located in the central halls, and the heat from them only partially reached the remote rooms. Moreover, these pockets produced a huge amount of smoke, which when mixed with the humid air, made it even more heavy and suffocating. Attempts to ventilate by opening the windows only let in more cold, humid air, negating all the heating efforts. Therefore, the windows were most often kept closed, creating a greenhouse effect for pathogens in the premises. Chronic exposure to cold and dampness led to numerous health problems, in addition to respiratory diseases. Arthritis and rheumatism were almost unavoidable companions of life in the castle, especially for the elderly. Pain in the joints and muscles became commonplace, limiting mobility and impairing the quality of life. Hypothermia could lead to frostbite, especially on the fingers and toes, if strict precautions were not taken. Sleep in such conditions was shallow and did not bring a full rest, which aggravated the general exhaustion of the body. In addition, mold and mildew growing profusely on the walls released mycotoxins that, if inhaled, could cause allergic reactions, headaches, dizziness, and even more serious liver and kidney diseases in the long run. The walls literally breathed spores, making each breath potentially dangerous. Children whose immune systems were not yet fully developed were particularly vulnerable to these threats. Infant mortality in medieval castles was extremely high, and living conditions certainly played a significant role in this. Despite periodic attempts to maintain basic cleanliness, castles became hotbeds of stench in winter. The lack of effective ventilation, windows were closed to preserve some heat, creating stagnant air, crowding of people and animals in primitive or non-existent waste disposal systems led to a terrifying, pervasive stench. Castle ditches were often used as open sewers, and their contents, consisting of waste products and garbage, froze in winter. But at the slightest thaw, they began to melt, spreading an unbearable stench for many meters around. The smell of smoke from hearths that had no proper chimneys mingled with the smell of unwashed bodies, animal excrement, rotting food waste, moldy fabrics, and musty damp walls. This fragrant mixture permeated literally everything: clothes, furniture, hair, skin. People of the Middle Ages were, of course, much more tolerant of unpleasant odors than modern people living in the era of hygiene and deodorants. But even for them, this was a constant test, affecting their health, mood, and even appetite. The sources of the stench were numerous and varied. Latrines, or closets, as they were sometimes called, were projections in the walls from which sewage fell directly into the moat or on the ground under the castle walls. In winter, when the sewage pits froze, their contents could accumulate, creating an even stronger and more persistent smell. Inside the premises, portable chamber pots were used, the contents of which were often poured directly out of the windows, especially in cases where there were not enough wardrobes for all the inhabitants. This meant that in addition to the smell inside, the outside air was also polluted. The accumulation of animals inside the castle walls, especially in the cold season, also added its share to the overall fetid picture. Horses, dogs, chickens, and even pigs could be kept in close proximity to living quarters, and their feces, urine, and body odor would inevitably spread everywhere. In the absence of regular cleaning and disinfection, which were almost impossible in those conditions, the ammonia smell from urine and decomposing organic substances became unbearable. The untidy remains of food decomposing in dark corners were also a constant source of unpleasant odors. In the absence of refrigerators and efficient waste disposal methods, food quickly deteriorated, attracting insects and rodents, which worsened unsanitary conditions. Water used for cooking and drinking was often taken from wells located inside or near the castle, and could be contaminated with sewage, resulting in its unpleasant smell and taste. The smell of smoke from open fires was everywhere. Even if there were similar chimneys in the halls, they were rarely effective, and most of the smoke remained inside the rooms, irritating the eyes and lungs. The smoke soaked through clothes, hair, and even skin, leaving a permanent coating. This smell was not only unpleasant, but also harmful to health, causing a chronic cough, inflammation of the respiratory tract, and increasing the risk of developing lung diseases. All this created an unbearable atmosphere, which was not only unpleasant for the senses, but also had serious consequences for the mental and physical health of the inhabitants of the castle. Constant exposure to unpleasant odors could cause headaches, nausea, loss of appetite, and general discomfort. It also contributed to the spread of diseases, as the stench was often a sign of unsanitary conditions favorable for the reproduction of bacteria and viruses. Even rich lords, despite their privileges, couldn't completely avoid this aromatic attack. Although their quarters might be a little cleaner and better ventilated, the overall atmosphere of the castle remained unchanged. Incense and aromatic herbs that were once used to mask odors could only temporarily drown them out, but not eliminate the source of the problem. In the end, the smell was an integral part of medieval castle life, a constant reminder of the harsh conditions of that time. If the nobility, because of their status, had at least some semblance of bedrooms, often with canopies which served to keep the heat around the bed at least a little, then for the vast majority of servants, the conditions were completely unbearable. Squires, maids, cooks, soldiers, grooms, and other laborers slept wherever they could. On the cold stone floor of the main hall, wrapped in thin cloaks or blankets by the fireplace, in narrow windswept corridors, in unheated storerooms, or on hard, often damp, straw mats in the common barracks. These straw beds, by the way, also served as a breeding ground for parasites. These places were windswept, often had no windows or had primitive, loosely closed shutters, and were completely devoid of any insulation. Sleep was shallow, constantly interrupted by the piercing cold, the rustling of rats and mice, and other noises of castle life. Such a bedroom did not give either a full rest or recuperation, which affected the health, immunity, and productivity of servants, making them even more vulnerable to illness and accidents. Chronic lack of sleep and cold sleep undermined their vitality. Imagine an ordinary night in a medieval castle for a simple servant. After a long, grueling day filled with hard physical labor, there is nothing left but the desire to fall and forget. But even this desire was difficult to achieve. Darkness, broken only by the faint glow of a few candles or the glow of the fire from the communal hearth, filled the space. The cold seeped through her thin clothes, making her shiver. The stone floor drained the remaining heat from the body, and even if it was possible to find a place closer to the fireplace, the connection was only partial since the heat spread unevenly, and on one side it could be unbearably hot, and on the other, frosty. The straw bedding, if any, offered only the illusion of comfort. They quickly strayed, became wet with condensation and sweat, and most importantly, were an ideal breeding ground for fleas, bedbugs, lice, and other unpleasant insects. The constant itching and biting kept me going, causing skin irritation and spreading diseases. Rats and mice, which felt like the rightful owners of the castle, began their activity at nightfall, rustling, squeaking, and sometimes daring attacks directly on sleeping people. I had to sleep in full clothes to keep myself warm. However, this meant that clothing soaked in the day's sweat and dirt remained on the body all night, exacerbating unsanitary conditions and contributing to the development of skin diseases. Bath treatments were rare, especially in winter, and this only added to the general discomfort. The servants' bodies were constantly covered in a layer of dirt, sweat, and grease, which attracted even more parasites. The consequences of such a dream were disastrous. Constant lack of sleep led to chronic fatigue, decreased concentration, and slower reactions. Servants became more prone to accidents at work. Their immune systems weakened, making them easy prey for any infections that flourished in the castle gardens. Illnesses such as colds, flu, and bronchitis, as well as more serious infections, were often fatal because the body was too exhausted to fight. Even when a servant fell ill, he was rarely provided with adequate conditions for recovery. Places for the sick were limited, medical care was primitive, and food was scarce. Therefore, illness often meant disability, and in the worst case, death. The life of a servant in a medieval castle in winter was a constant balancing act on the edge of survival, where every day brought new challenges of cold, hunger, and lack of sleep. It was a brutal cycle that undermined health and shortened life expectancy. Dogs and sometimes other small animals, cats for rodent control, weasels, and in rare cases even small tame pigs, often slept together with people in bed or right by the hearth. This was not so much a sentimental love of animals as a pragmatic necessity and a matter of survival. The animals released heat, and their bodies served as living hot water bottles, helping to warm up at least a little in ice beds where the temperature could be below zero. Large dogs often slept at their owners' feet, providing an extra layer of warmth and possibly guarding in their sleep. However, this also contributed to the mass spread of fleas, ticks, and other parasites that jumped from animals to humans, and also worsened the general unsanitary conditions in the premises, adding animal scents to odors and parasite-borne infections to diseases. At the same time, despite all these disadvantages, the benefits of live Christmas trees outweighed the inconvenience. In the absence of central heating and efficient heat preservation facilities, every available facility was used to maintain at least some degree of comfort. Animal body heat was one of the most affordable and efficient sources of heating. Imagine a cold, chilly night in a castle, when your breath is steaming and your bed feels like a block of ice. In such a situation, being able to snuggle up to a warm, living creature, whether it was a dog or a cat, was invaluable. This helped you fall asleep and keep your body temperature at an acceptable level, preventing hypothermia. In addition, the dogs performed other functions. They were security guards, alerting the owners of approaching intruders or danger. In the face of constant threat, whether it was an enemy attack or internal intrigue, having a loyal watchdog was vital. Cats, in turn, were irreplaceable in the fight against rodents. Mice and rats not only damaged food supplies and property, but also carried dangerous diseases such as the plague. The cat in the castle was not just a pet, but a necessary nurse. However, such close proximity to animals had its downside. Animal hygiene in the Middle Ages was almost zero. They were not washed regularly, not treated for parasites. This meant that fleas, ticks, and lice living on animal fur could easily jump over to humans. The bites of these parasites caused unbearable itching, skin irritation, and could also cause various skin infections, such as dermatitis and boils. Moreover, the parasites could carry more serious diseases, such as typhus, which in conditions of crowding and unsanitary conditions, quickly spread among the population of the castle. The smell of animals was also an unavoidable part of castle life. The wet fur, the smell of secretions, the fur gathering in the corners, all this added to the general bouquet of stench that reigned in the castle. However, in those conditions, people were so used to these smells that they were not perceived as something out of the ordinary. Pragmatism won out over aesthetics. Despite the apparent incombustibility of the castle's stone walls, fires were a constant and deadly threat. The main combustible materials wood, beams, floors, furniture, chests, straw, bedding, roofs and outbuildings, furniture stuffing, fabric, clothing, tapestries, banners. Easily ignited from the slightest spark. Open hearths, torches, and candles, which were used for lighting and were the only source of light on long, dark evenings, posed a huge risk. The slightest carelessness, a fallen torch, or a spark from the fireplace could lead to instant disaster. The smoke from the fire could quickly fill the entire castle, causing suffocation and panic, disorienting people in the pitch darkness. Water for extinguishing fires, especially in winter, when all water sources could be frozen, was catastrophically insufficient. The castle, being a fortress, could at any moment turn into a fiery trap, from which there was no way out. Given the low temperatures, getting outside during a fire was tantamount to death from hypothermia, even if you managed to avoid the flames. Many died not from fire, but from hypothermia, trying to escape from the fire in the icy night. The stone walls of the castle, although they were fire-resistant in themselves, could not protect the inner rooms from fire, which were literally packed with flammable materials. Wooden floors and stairs served as excellent conduits for fire, allowing it to spread quickly between floors and rooms. Furniture, chests of clothing, stores of grain and straw, all this was the perfect fuel for a fire. Even tapestries that might appear massive were made of wool or linen, and when dry, they flashed instantly. The main sources of fire were open hearths in the great halls and fireplaces in the chambers of the nobility. Often, sparks from the fire could fly out on flammable objects located too close. Cooking also carried risks. Fat could catch fire. Overturned dishes could cause a fire. Torches and candles, although the only means of illumination, were extremely dangerous. The slightest draft, careless movement, or a simple fall could lead to disaster. Long, dark winter nights required constant lighting, which increased the risk. When a fire started, the speed of its spread was staggering. Wooden structures broke out instantly, and in a confined space, the fire quickly gained strength. Smoke, saturated with combustion products, quickly filled all the rooms. It was not just annoying, but deadly. Carbon monoxide caused suffocation and loss of consciousness, disorienting people who tried to find a way out. In a panic, people could easily get lost in the maze of corridors and rooms, especially in the darkness and smoke. The water problem was one of the most critical. Castles were often located on high ground, and water supply systems capable of supplying water under pressure did not exist. Water was stored in wells or cisterns that could freeze in winter. It was almost impossible to raise enough water in buckets to extinguish a large fire. The limited water supply was barely enough for drinking, let alone firefighting. Even if someone managed to get out of the burning castle, there was another danger waiting for them on the street: freezing cold. People who jumped out in nightgowns or thin clothing, without shoes in sub-zero temperatures, were at risk of hypothermia and frostbite. Many died from the cold while trying to escape the fire, or suffered severe frostbite that could lead to amputation of limbs. Thus, a fire in a medieval castle in winter was not just a threat to property, but also almost guaranteed death for many of its inhabitants. This was one of the most terrible and devastating disasters that could befall the fortress. Water entering under the stone slabs of the roofs or along the walls through numerous cracks and crevices froze, creating ice and icicles not only outside, but also inside the castle. Frozen drains, if they were functioning at all, and numerous cracks in the walls caused meltwater to seep into the rooms, forming puddles on the floors and making them incredibly slippery and dangerous. Ice could form on the interior surfaces of walls at window openings and even on furniture, turning objects into ice sculptures, as if the castle was enchanted. This created a feeling of constant cold and dampness, which could not be eliminated either day or night, and also posed a serious risk of falling and injuries to residents, especially in poorly lit corridors and stairs. Any careless movement could result in a fracture or dislocation. Imagine a morning in the castle. Outside the window it is freezing, but inside, despite the burning hearths, the air is permeated with cold. Ice crunches under my feet. Water seeped through the porous stone and loose joints and froze, forming intricate patterns and growths on the walls. These ice curtains were not only a constant reminder of the biting cold, but also melted at the slightest increase in temperature, turning into rivulets that trickled down the walls, forming puddles on the floor. The wooden floors were rotting from the constant humidity, while the stone floors were becoming slippery and dangerous. Every step required caution. Stairs covered with a thin crust of ice were particularly dangerous. In poor lighting conditions, when the only light source was dim torches or candles, the risk of tripping and falling was extremely high. Broken limbs, dislocations, and concussions were all commonplace. For a medieval person who did not have access to modern medicine, even a simple fracture could cause disability or death due to infection. In addition to the physical injuries, the constant presence of ice and water inside the premises added to the feeling of discomfort and hopelessness. The clothes and bedclothes were still damp and musty smelling. Wooden objects swelled and cracked, and metal was covered with rust. Even food could suffer from moisture, becoming moldy and becoming unfit for consumption. Roofs constructed of stone slabs or tiles without proper waterproofing were particularly vulnerable. Snow accumulating on the roof melted under the influence of heat from the inside or sunlight, and then seeped in through the cracks. Drains, if they existed at all, were often clogged with ice and debris, unable to cope with their function. As a result, water flowed directly down the walls, further cooling them and contributing to the formation of ice. This problem wasn't just limited to living quarters. Storerooms, armories, kitchens, all of them suffered from excessive humidity. Grain supplies could grow moldy, weapons could rust, and clothing could rot. Even books and parchments stored in the castle were exposed to the risk of damage from moisture and fungus, which led to the irretrievable loss of valuable knowledge and documents. In general, the ice and water inside the castle were a constant reminder of the impotence of man before the elements and of the harshness of medieval life. The winter months were a time of enforced isolation and tedium. Roads became impassable due to deep snow and ice, and rivers and streams froze, making travel extremely dangerous and lengthy. Life in the castle slowed to an excruciating pace. Due to the cold and wet weather, many activities available in the summer, hunting, walking, night training on the parade ground, tournaments, were completely impossible. People spent most of their time in stuffy, poorly lit, and cold rooms. Lack of variety, primitive entertainment, stories, songs, rare games like chess or backgammon, and a constant feeling of cold, compounded by darkness, led to deep boredom, despondency, and compounded depressive states. Quarrels, conflicts, and even fights were common in these confined, stressful environments, where people were forced to constantly stay in close contact. Winter in a medieval castle was not just a cold season, but a period of complete isolation. Snow-covered roads and frozen rivers cut off the castle from the outside world. The arrival of guests became rare, and news arrived late or not at all. This created a sense of isolation and stagnation, which in itself could cause a sense of despondency. For the nobles who were used to active life, hunting, tournaments, and feasts, the winter months were especially difficult. Instead of exciting adventures, they were waiting for a monotonous stay in stuffy, poorly ventilated halls. Hunting was almost impossible due to the deep snow and frostbite. Tournaments and outdoor night training were also canceled, making it impossible for knights to keep fit and show off their skills. Entertainment was extremely limited and quickly bored. Stories and songs were the main way to pass the time, but even these could not completely dispel boredom, especially when the repertoire was limited. Games like chess, Backgammon, or craps, were accessible to only a few, and in low-light conditions, playing them was tiring to the eyes. Reading books, if available, was a luxury, and the lighting was too dim for extended reading. The constant crowding of a large number of people in a limited space aggravated the psychological tension. The lack of personal space, constant smells, noise, and cold created an atmosphere conducive to irritability. Minor quarrels could quickly escalate into major conflicts, and aggression, which had no way out, accumulated. The lack of opportunities to get out into the fresh air and change the environment only increased these negative emotions. The social hierarchy, which could be more flexible in the summer, became tougher in the winter. The differences in living conditions between nobles and servants became especially noticeable, causing tension and discontent. Chronic malnutrition and lack of vitamins, as already mentioned, also affected the mental state of people, causing apathy, irritability, and even hallucinations in particularly severe cases of hunger. Winter boredom was not just a mild discomfort, but a serious test for the psyche. Long, dark, cold days and nights without any change of environment could lead to depressive states, aggravation of fears and anxiety. In an environment where survival was a daily struggle, any additional psychological pressure became unbearable. The lack of positive incentives and the constant expectation of spring was a heavy burden for all the inhabitants of the castle. Medieval clothing, though layered, was far from modern thermal insulation materials. Wool and linen, often of coarse weave, did not provide sufficient protection from the biting wind and did not retain heat properly. Furs, available only to the nobility, also had their drawbacks. They were heavy, constrained movement, poorly absorbed moisture, and became a breeding ground for parasites. The clothes were bulky and restricted movement, making it difficult to perform everyday tasks. The inner layers quickly absorbed sweat and then became cold and wet, especially if the person was actively moving. Drying clothes was extremely difficult due to the lack of suitable conditions. So many people wore wet clothes for several days, which significantly increased the risk of colds, pneumonia, and frostbite. Chronic chills were the norm. The linen and cotton fabrics sussed for the lower layers were even less effective in retaining heat and also easily got wet. The lack of high-quality dyes led to the fact that the clothes were dull, nondescript colors, which further aggravated the gloomy atmosphere. In addition, washing clothes was rare, especially in winter, which led to the accumulation of dirt, sweat, and grease, which in turn reduced the effectiveness of the fabric as an insulator. Shoes were also extremely impractical. Often these were simple leather shoes or boots without any lining or water resistance. The feet were constantly cold and wet, which led to frostbite and the development of problems such as trench foot, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet in a cold and humid environment. Even thick wool stockings couldn't completely protect her from the biting cold. Hats and gloves were rare for the general population, and if they were, they also did not provide sufficient protection. Exposed areas of the skin quickly froze, increasing the risk of frostbite on the ears, nose, and fingers. Constant exposure to cold on unprotected parts of the body led to frostbite even in relatively light frosts, especially in combination with wind. The health consequences of such primitive clothing were extremely serious. Chronic chills were a constant companion of life. The body spent a huge amount of energy on maintaining body temperature, which led to exhaustion and made people more susceptible to diseases. Colds, bronchitis, and pneumonia were common, and in the absence of antibiotics, they often led to death. Frostbite, especially in the extremities, was not uncommon and could lead to amputations or lifelong disability. Thus, clothing in a medieval castle in winter was not just uncomfortable, but a factor that constantly threatened the health and life of its inhabitants, making them vulnerable to the elements and diseases. This was another aspect of the harsh reality in which the parish and the people of that time were allowed to survive. Dampness fuel extraction was a continuous, hard, and dangerous job, especially in winter. The forest around the castle was rapidly being cut down, and it was necessary to go further and further for firewood, sometimes for several miles, going deeper into wild, dangerous places. This not only increased their time in a fore, but also put the woodcutters at risk of being attacked by wild animals or bandits hiding in the forest thickets. Each trip for firewood became a real expedition, requiring careful preparation and courage. Getting heavy armfuls of firewood to the castle was a grueling task, especially in winter over deep snow and ice, where every step was a challenge. Sleds or carts, if available, made transportation easier, but often the firewood had to be carried on its own, which required incredible physical endurance. Coal was rarely used, was very expensive, and was available only in some regions where there were coal deposits. Its transportation over long distances was almost impossible due to the high cost and lack of developed infrastructure, which made it inaccessible to the majority of the population. The fuel was worth its weight in gold. They saved him every scrap of wood, and even in rich castles, they could not afford to constantly light all the fireplaces. Often the fires were lit only in the main hall at certain times of the day, usually in the evening, and everyone in the castle, from the lord to the afternoon servant, gathered there to get some warmth. This created a kind of ritual where everyone shared a common warmth, which brought them closer together, despite the difference in status. However, fighting for every splinter, for every piece of wood, was a matter of survival and could lead to conflicts. There were frequent cases of theft of firewood, which in severe winters could cost lives. The constant shortage of fuel formed a special mentality where thrift and prudence became key qualities. The medieval English castle in winter was not a cozy home, not a symbol of romance, but a real test of strength, a challenge to human endurance. It was a world where stone was the enemy, smoke the inevitable companion, and drafts the constant threat. People survived not because of, but in spite of, the architecture of their homes, relying on countless layers of clothing, incredible strength of mind, primitive but vital methods of fighting the cold, and often just luck. The story of Castle Winter is not a tale of medieval romance, not a picturesque illustration of ballads, but a harsh truth about human endurance and the amazing ability to adapt to the most unbearable conditions. This is a powerful reminder of how far we have come in creating a comfortable living environment and how valuable the warmth that we are so used to in our homes is. Which of these facts about medieval winter surprised you the most, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments.